The Middle East is burning, but this time the fuse wasn't lit in Tehran or Gaza. It ignited along Israel's northern border, where a new front tore open with enough force to shake the entire region. Before dawn, the Galilee's cool air carried the smell of earth and citrus. Dogs barked at nothing. A muezzin's call drifted across a ridge. Farther down the road, a synagogue's early minyan murmured in low voices as pages turned. A farmer checked irrigation lines by headlamp, breath misting in the dark. Then the quiet unraveled. Sirens climbed. The first contrails painted the sky as if drawn by a frantic hand. Calm turned into a lattice of fire. An orange line crossed a ridge and became 3, then 10. The sound changed from birds to turbines to a rolling echo that flattened conversation into a reflex. Run, cover, call. Hezbollah opened with an assault that felt less like a barrage and more like a calculation, sliding from blackboard to horizon. 300 rockets and loitering munitions lifted inside a compressed window. The launch cadence was choir and clockwork. On screens in rooms with no windows, green returns crowded corners like ivy. Around 200 were intercepted. Nearly 100 got through. That ratio is not a statistic on a briefing slide when you live beneath it. It's a noise you count between your ribs. Command infrastructure and residential zones took hits. In minutes, northern Israel became a war zone without a safe corridor. Children were hustled from beds to basements in Metula, small hands on stair rails polished by panic. A nurse in Safed pushed hospital beds into hallways away from windows and taped cardboard over the ones she couldn't move, holding a roll of tape in her teeth. In Kiryat Shmona, the difference between siren and impact melted into a single roar, and a man watering his geraniums found himself in a doorway listening for the end of the roar, like a diver waits for the surface. Across the fence, in southern Lebanon, shutters snapped closed. A shopkeeper in Ben Jabil wiped flour off his hands and pulled in a crate of pita dough as the power flickered, counting out loud, 1, 2, 3, to calm a boy who asked if school was canceled again. A grandmother leaned too long over a gas flame and then laughed at herself because in a kitchen you try to keep something normal. For years, Iron Dome lived as more than a system. It was a legend. A shield that turned incoming math into harmless smoke. Anything Gaza threw, it seemed to swat aside. People timed their coffee breaks to interception windows. An entire nation learned to trust a parabola's predictable arc. But this was not Gaza. This was a saturation strategy aimed at the numbers behind modern missile defense. Multiple launch points, complex terrain, hundreds of simultaneous returns forcing split-second choices in a control room where green blips multiplied faster than hands could point. Coffee went cold on consoles. A commander's knuckles whitened around a headset as he asked for one more battery to swivel, one more angle, one more chance to bend probability into safety. Reload cranes whirring as crews counted seconds with their teeth. A technician yanked a jammed hatch and slammed it shut with his shoulder because the manual lever takes longer and seconds have become a currency. Latency measured not in code, but in heart rate. The attackers understood the tempo. Older rockets fed into the swarm as decoys, meant to pull expensive shots in the wrong direction. Low-flying UAVs hugged the folds of hills with small radar signatures and unpredictable paths. They didn't arrive as cinematic walls of flame. They skimmed quietly, nosing into gaps that aren't visible on maps. Some flights probed for the defender's rhythm. Some were aimed at the very launchers tasked with protecting the towns beneath, trying to turn the act of defense into a vulnerability. Operators lowered their heads as the geometry of protection exposure twisted into a knot no diagram could untie. This was not a random storm. It was a recipe tested, adjusted, and executed. On the ground, the result was blunt. White interceptor trails and orange rocket streaks stitched the sky. Every gap found a price below. A transformer yard popped in a spray of sparks and darkness rolled through a neighborhood. An elevator stuck between floors and two strangers spoke through the doors to reassure each other they weren't alone. A reserve base lost a communications node and a commander's voice went thin with static. Windows blew inward on a quiet street and a kitchen table turned into a field of glitter. The cat that sleeps there vanished under a bed and wouldn't come out until evening. 1 in 3 attacking projectiles striking home is not just a ratio, it is a threshold. It means the outer edge of what people believe is possible has moved closer to their doorstep. The hardware absorbed much. It did not absorb all. Firefighters in heavy coats jogged uphill past stone terraces that smell like sage. Medics threaded between cars, abandoned at odd angles. An old man stood with a broom on a balcony clearing glass as if sweeping could push back the current. A bus driver parked and turned to face his passengers. Teenagers headed to a field trip they would not take and tried to make a joke that fell apart halfway through his smile. The damage was physical, but the deeper hit was psychological. Iron Dome has always been more than interceptors and launch rails. It has been the confidence engine for daily life and economic continuity. The assumption that the sky is managed. When that confidence trembles, markets twitch, the shekel slides. Insurance premiums on ports tick upward. The Tel Aviv exchange opens to red screens and analysts rehearse phrases like temporary shock while their eyes betray the math. A trader in London adjusts oil futures and pretends not to watch a muted live feed. Parents send texts that read, "all okay," every hour on the hour. Coffee shops stay half full, and when a truck backfires, a whole street flinches. A wedding moves from an outdoor garden to a windowless hall. A factory manager checks his stock of imported bearings because he knows the ship schedules are not promises anymore. A defensive doctrine that looked like a regional gold standard just brushed its ceiling, and everything below it looks different now. Hezbollah's capability also looked different from old stereotypes. Not sandal-wearing guerrillas lobbing steel tubes into fields. Structured warfare backed by Iranian engineering and training, integrating precision-guided munitions with single-digit accuracy and loitering systems that exploit coverage gaps. Teams that study weather, cadence, the time it takes a convoy to clear a ridge. Families of missiles comparable to what the region has seen in the FAT 110 lineage. And adapted variants brought a harsher focus on high-value nodes, radar stations, air defense sites, data centers, command hubs. Hit those, and the defender must prioritize them at maximum cost, even if it means leaving small towns to the mercy of probability. And this is where the economic trap narrows. A Tamir interceptor costs tens of thousands of dollars. Doctrine often fires 2 per target, roughly $100,000 per engagement, as policy rather than indulgence. On the other side, a simple rocket can cost a fraction of that. In a salvo of 300, Hezbollah's bill stayed under a mid-range luxury car. Israel burned through the price of a hospital wing and interceptors within hours, not counting fuel, crews, or the damage from what slipped through. That is the asymmetry. Maintain the tempo just high enough to demand constant response, and the defender pays in cash and in nerves. You can read this as an accounting problem, but it's also a sleep problem. It keeps finance officials in fluorescent rooms tapping pencils against spreadsheets, and it keeps gunners blinking hard to keep targets from doubling. Stockpiles thin. Procurement officers refresh spreadsheets and call partners at odd hours. Resupply pipelines collide with politics and manufacturing capacity. Contracts run into committees. Air crews reach the edge of their duty cycles. Reservists leave orchards and startups and universities and stand in uniform lines that smell like dust and coffee. The hum of a 3D printer in a small workshop in Haifa becomes a song of patriotism as it spits out brackets for something no one wants to publicize, and even that song is finite. Every hour at high tempo drains a little more from the civilian economy. Displaced communities need roofs and meals and classrooms and borrowed gyms. School principals learn the names of families they never expected to meet. Municipal budget lines turn into triage lists. The meter runs while the clock refuses to stop. All of this sits inside a wider strategy Iran has been welding together for years. Multiple fronts. From the south, pressure from Gaza remnants and Houthi forces reaching into shipping lanes. From the north, a fully constituted fighting entity in Hezbollah. To the east, militias that can light up a border or a base for effect and then melt back into cities where loyalties braid like wires. Logistics stretch thin, supply lines become targets. Elite units are redeployed from one flashpoint to the next and learn the limits of being everywhere. Radar coverage, interceptor reserves, and F-35 sorties must be divided across simultaneous demands. Commanders pick from an ugly menu, accept risk here to mitigate risk there, every choice narrowing the next one. It is a vice that tightens options with each turn. So what are the options? Continue the defensive model and accept accelerating depletion. Or cross the border into Lebanon and step into ground that eats momentum. Terraces and wadis built for olives and ambushes. Limestone ridges cut by goat paths that twist into firing angles. Villages with tunnels beneath them and firing points pre-registered years ago. Terrain designed to strip tech advantages down to courage and luck. A young platoon leader can explain the tactical plan on paper. The first time he hears a shot bounce between stone walls, like a thrown coin, he will learn the second plan, the one that depends on whether his voice can steady his own hands. Laser-based intercept systems that could flip the cost curve are still in trials and planning slides. Power requirements, weather, integration, problems that yield to engineering, but not instantly, not in a dawn where people are already in stairwells. The present tense is unforgiving. 6 figures per intercept and rising pressure every day. Israel did not stay silent. Before first light fully reached the ridgelines, the response began. 35 I Adir fighters slid through the dark with bays heavy and radios clipped. The breath in the cockpit narrows to a metronome. Heads-up displays drew neat shapes over an untidy reality. They carried deep strike packages against operational infrastructure in the Bekaa Valley and beyond. Precision and bunker-penetrating munitions found launch sites. Secondary explosions marked storage bunkers. Pillars of smoke rose for kilometers. A message etched itself across the valley, capability and will remain intact. A house cat in a town miles away darted under a bed at the concussive wave of an explosion it never saw. Somewhere in a control room, a watcher noted that while the site turned to rubble, a mobile launcher that had fired an hour before had already vanished into the folds of the terrain. Air power can suppress and degrade. It can't erase networks designed to go to ground between pulses. Every sortie carries escalation risk, munitions expenditure, and diplomatic cost that shows up in the next phone call from a foreign capital. The cost also shows up when a pilot's hands shake later, unseen, pouring coffee. Meanwhile, the superpowers are quiet in a way that feels cold. Ceasefire language circulates, action does not. In Washington, national security staff weigh support for Israel against the risk of a wider fight with Iran and the shock of an energy spike that would empty political capital overnight. A mid-level staffer rubs his eyes at 3 a.m., stares at a map with too many arrows, and asks quietly if the arrows are decisions or descriptions. Moscow notes that Western attention is a finite resource and sees advantage in every diverted hour. A screen in the Kremlin glows with a map of pipelines and time zones. Beijing keeps its tone level and its options open, counting the contracts that follow destruction as surely as the ships that follow oil. In Brussels, an official drafts a statement that will be outpaced by reality before it's translated. International institutions sound ceremonial. The rule set is being written by those who can shape the ground in real time and hold it long enough for a new normal to form. Gulf capitals send signals in the language of fuel shipments and quiet visits. Everyone watches, everyone watch. The worst case is not hard to sketch. Israel commits to a full-scale push north. The terrain turns speed into attrition and the calendar into casualty lists. A nation that has measured wars in days remembers another that stretched into weeks and then tries not to remember. Iran answers by moving to close the Strait of Hormuz with fast craft mines and cruise missiles launched from coastal batteries and shadow ports. Not a declaration, an accumulation. Energy markets leap past recent memory. Tanker traffic slows as insurers balk and navies reroute. Lines lengthen at gas stations far from any desert. Airlines redraw maps in midair. Flight attendants learn to explain detours with a smile. In the south, shipping lanes feel more pressure as Houthi units continue to threaten maritime traffic and freight rates double without ceremony. A container ship captain stares at a screen clogged with red lines and reconsiders the meaning of the word lane. And in the most extreme scenario, the nuclear dimension that has haunted doctrine for decades moves from theory to a choice no one wants to describe aloud. No one thinks in entirety, they think in thresholds and signals, and what their rival believes they believe. A misread. A misfire, an accident dressed as intent. This is the vocabulary of nightmare. This is not just a regional story, it is a stress test for the global system. It touches energy prices, shipping costs, investment flows, and the routine calm inside households on other continents. A factory in Italy waits for a chemical shipment that sits at anchor near Muscat and starts running overtime on a line. It can't keep full. A grocer in Nairobi adjusts prices because the delivery truck paid more for diesel, and he knows how many customers walk away when tomatoes cost that much. A retiree in Osaka watches a newscast and realizes her pension fund is underweight energy and overweight risk. In Mumbai, a commuter checks a headline and then his train app. The delay reads, operational reasons, but he knows the reason has nothing to do with tracks. In Rotterdam, a crane operator pauses as the wind picks up and wonders whether he just saw a ship turn that shouldn't have. In Houston, a refinery manager calls a midnight meeting about shift safety and feedstock. The line between front and rear grows faint. Inside the fight, other fronts flicker on. Cyber units trade blows, wipers against routers, spoof GPS against shipping lanes, less cinematic than contrails but just as disruptive. A port crane freezes mid-lift. A municipal water system operator watches his screen blink and then reboot as if nothing happened, even though his pulse knows something did. Hashtags metastasize, rumors outrun fact. A video of a distant explosion can move markets before anyone checks the timestamp. An old clip with a new caption flows across phones and becomes a new reality for an hour, which is sometimes long enough to be real. Algorithms amplify panic and patriotism indiscriminately. A teenager in Paris and a dock worker in Ashdod watch the same clip and feel opposite things equally strong. On one street in Tel Aviv, a finance ministry staffer wonders how to budget for a war with no end date, how to extend lines of credit for municipalities while keeping the curve from diving. She draws a line on a whiteboard and then erases it and draws it again a little lower. In Beirut, a shopkeeper counts the morning's customers on one hand and then locks the register anyway because he remembers a summer when he didn't. A teacher in Tyre writes a lesson plan for students she hasn't seen in a week and then throws it away because the electricity goes and the printer blinks and the siren starts. In Haifa and Tyre, the sea keeps its rhythm while the coasts jitter. Fishermen pull nets and look over their shoulders at plumes on shore, measuring the wind from the smell. A Red Crescent ambulance idles behind a UN checkpoint where blue helmets check phones for an update they know won't arrive. In a kibbutz, a grandmother tells a story about sirens from another war and then stops, because memory isn't always a comfort. Across the region, faith leaders open doors. A synagogue stocks bottled water in its basement, and a mosque down the street sends dates and tea for anyone sheltering there, because neighbors still share even when geopolitics does not. In a hospital corridor, a volunteer clowns for children in a way that makes their parents cry. In a newsroom, editors decide which image is too much and which is too little, and try to resist becoming part of someone else's strategy. The question now is simple and severe. Is there any circuit breaker left before escalation outruns control? Back channels through Muscat, a French number that still gets picked up in Riyadh and Jerusalem, a line between Washington and Tehran that avoids the cameras, a convoy route open for 6 hours, because someone called someone's cousin who used to be a classmate, a mutual pause not dressed up as victory but accepted as survival. There's a language for this that does not involve flags, a grammar made of pauses and misdirections, and a quiet choreography of letting a day pass without adding to the pile. And what is Iran's role in this geometry? Stabilizing actor who prefers a long, grinding squeeze without a breakage point, or the force that pushes past thresholds and rewrites the rules for good? The answer is not a paragraph in a think tank's PDF. It is a pattern that will reveal itself in the tempo of launches, the density of deconfliction calls, the coldness or warmth in a communique. It will show up in whether tankers gather offshore like birds at dusk or move in single file under escort. It will be measured in whether children on both sides of a border learn to sleep through sirens or forget what they sound like. The next dawn will say something. Whether it brings sirens or a silence people trust, again, will tell you which strategy is winning, the one that prizes breadth and budget and patience, or the one that believes only momentum matters. Between those, there is a country of compromises where leaders may yet steer, or not. In a room with no windows, someone watches a clock tick and hopes that the quiet, when it comes, is not just a pause between storms, but the beginning of a different weather.